Hello and welcome back. This is the Week 9 lecture. So today I would like to get started on literary criticism and theory. This is sort of the next unit, the next section of our class, and we just need to get a basic understanding of some of the different critical approaches, some of the different theoretical approaches that are often taken in literary study. So this is just part of our general education as we're learning more about literary study as an academic field. I want you to think about these different critical approaches as sort of like tools. They are tools for analysis. They are particular techniques or approaches that scholars and critics use when they're sitting down to analyze literature. So we're not going to become experts about all of these different schools. We're not going to learn every single thing there is to learn about them. This is more about broad coverage. We are just trying to basically do an overview so we have a general idea and so we can start to utilize some of these tools when we conduct literary analysis of our own. So when we talk about analyzing and interpreting texts, this is kind of a long history and a long tradition that we're going to cover a little bit today. But just make sure you know what we're doing here in week 9. We are starting on chapter 4, but we are only reading the first part of the chapter. So much like we did with chapter 2, chapter 4 is a very long chapter, so we are going to break it down into smaller segments, smaller parts. So here in week 9, we are just reading about text-based approaches to literature. So that means you only need to read from page 99 to page 114. We're only tackling the first 15 pages of chapter 4. So much like we did with the major literary genres, we're going to break our study of literary criticism and theory down into parts, in this case 4 parts. So we're going to start with text-based, then we're going to move to reader-oriented, then we are going to move to author-oriented. Actually, I think I'm getting those backwards. We do author next, then reader response. Then we're going to talk about different contextual approaches. So we're going to break this down into 4 parts. Part 1 is text-based, and that's what we're doing today. But also, we're just reading the very beginning of chapter 4, where they sort of provide, the author of our book, Claire, sort of provides a general overview of the history of literary interpretation and analysis. Again, we don't need to be experts, but let's just go over some of this. A lot of what he's covering throughout chapter 4 can be a little bit difficult to understand. I think sometimes he's using language or concepts that we might not always be familiar with. So I would like to simplify some things once again here in lecture. So he's talking about sort of the history of literary interpretation. And he goes all the way back to antiquity. Ancient cultures. And we've been spending a lot of time here, and as we've already seen, that makes sense because this really is where literature as we understand it started in the Western world. We've already seen how many ancient cultures had their own epics. They had their own lyric poetry. We know the ancient Greeks had their own theater tradition, so they were doing drama. So this makes sense. And in the book, they talk about magic and religion and how both had a pretty important influence on the sort of early practice of interpreting texts. So, Claire talks about sort of interpreting the dreams or the visions of oracles or prophets, soothsayers back in ancient societies. And he's saying the basic procedure the basic techniques that were used to analyze the dream or the vision of an oracle back in ancient Greece is still very much sort of what we do when we're analyzing and interpreting literary text. We're trying to figure out what the text means. We're trying to figure out what the text says. And that's what the analyzers were doing back in ancient Greece, no matter what the text might be. The text might be a dream. The text might be a religious story. We might be looking at a religious text like the Bible. So if we're looking at the history of literary analysis, we can go back to antiquity and dreams and visions and certain kind of religious festivals that they had, but we can also look at the early stages of Judeo-Christian religion, and we can see how a lot of our analytical traditions come from analyzing religious texts. So like the book says, analyzing religious text is often called exegesis. And that's a term that was originally used exclusively for analyzing the Bible. And it can also apply to other religious texts. Now we use the term exegesis often to just mean analyzing any kind of text or, conducting any kind of literary analysis. But originally it was really kind of specific to religious texts. And as many of us know, religious texts often contain a lot of encoded language, a lot of figurative language, a lot of symbols. There's often some ambiguity at work. So we can understand why it was necessary for early scholars and critics to interpret these texts, to analyze these texts, because they're not always immediately obvious and apparent upon your first reading. So these are where a lot of our traditions started in the early days of Christianity, and then also legal texts. The book mentions that legal texts, along with religious texts, kind of help to provide some standards and rules that we still use for literature. So we had to analyze and interpret legal texts for some of the same reasons that we had to do those things with religious texts. As they put it in the chapter, legal texts, things having to do with laws and courtroom procedures and the application of laws, that stuff is considered indirectly accessible. Well, what does that mean? It just means that the law will get applied and interpreted different ways depending on different situations, different contexts, different circumstances. Much like religion. So certain religious rules or certain symbols or messages included in religious texts, they have to be analyzed within a certain context, or they have to be applied in a certain way. They have to be interpreted in a certain way. They're not going to mean the same thing to everybody in every situation. And that's very true with legal text as well. That's just true of the law in general. Those texts are indirectly accessible. They demand interpretation based on particular, specific, individual situations and contexts. So legal scholars had to engage in interpretive work, just like religious scholars had to do that type of work with religious texts like the Bible or the Quran. So these techniques really grew up largely because of religious analysis or legal analysis. The kind of interpretation that was being done with those kinds of texts, that formed the basis for what we now do with literature. So we even get the term interpretation from the study of religious texts and the study of legal texts. And that's really a central core concept nowadays to literary study, this idea that we have to interpret text. But we're kind of even just borrowing that terminology from the legal profession and from the study of religious texts. So there's a long history and tradition here that we are sort of inheriting, and we still use a lot of those older techniques and traditions today. Even if we're looking at literature, not legal text, not religious text. So we're looking at a lot of the same things. What individual words mean, the messages contained within language, certain figures of speech. If we're looking at religious text, again, we're viewing a lot of symbolism. We're trying to interpret perhaps figurative language. So again, a lot of that work is still with us. We still do it. So one thing we need to understand before we go any further, within the larger category of literary study, which is what this class is all about. This is an introduction to literary study. That's what 203 is. Within that big academic field, we need to make a basic distinction between literary criticism on one hand and literary theory on the other hand. These are very closely related terms, but they do mean two slightly different things. So, literary criticism refers to the analysis, the interpretation, and the evaluation of literary texts, lyric poetry, fiction, or drama. But remember those key words: analysis, interpretation, and evaluation. So we're analyzing, we're figuring out how the text work. We're also figuring out what they mean, the messages they are sending. That's the interpretation part. And then we also can evaluate. When we write literary criticism, we can decide if texts are successful. We can choose between two different texts, which one is better, who does it best, all of that stuff. So we kind of get that. I think most of us have at least a general idea of, what literary criticism is. So it mostly consists of analysis, interpretation, and evaluation. Literary theory, on the other hand, is a little bit different. So literary theory is really a distinct academic discipline nowadays, and it's influenced very heavily by philosophy and linguistics, these other academic fields that are quite different, really. In many ways, they're quite different than literary study. So with literary theory, we're really sort of taking a more philosophical approach. We're analyzing sort of how these texts get made. We're sort of analyzing the methodological premises, the premises of these texts, sort of how they're made, how they achieve meaning, but also the focus is often on criticism itself. Theory often examines literary criticism in addition to examining literary texts themselves. So theory is often very concerned about how criticism happens, how criticism gets written, how criticism works, how the meaning of criticism sort of gets out there to the larger public. So theory and criticism aren't the same. But there's not always a clear line dividing them. A lot of literary criticism uses aspects of theory. So theory will show up in a lot of literary criticism. And sometimes works of theory are doing things that are very similar to what literary criticism typically does. So some works of theory might be evaluating texts or perhaps attempting to interpret texts. But that's not the sole focus of theory. Most criticism wants to analyze, interpret, evaluate. Theory might be a little bit more interested in sort of larger philosophical questions, not so much what does this text mean, but more like what does this text say about some larger social movement or some larger development in culture or society, or what does it say about language? What does it say about major belief systems that we use and value in the Western world? So theory can take us to a lot of different places, but sometimes theory does some of the same things as criticism. Sometimes criticism sounds and reads a lot like theory, so there's a lot of overlap, but they are a little bit different based on those definitions that I just gave you. But the book provides 4 basic schools, basic approaches that most works of literary criticism and theory fall into. So we can call these the main critical approaches. And we are mostly going to be talking about literary criticism because that's what matters a little bit more to us. Like I said, literary theory sometimes takes us a little bit more into philosophy, maybe linguistics, rhetoric, other fields that we will mention. We'll mention at least some of those today. But literary criticism is a little bit more in our wheelhouse as a central, constant feature of literary study. And again, we can use theory. We often do. Theory shows up. Theory can be useful. But we're going to talk a little bit more about critical approaches. These are the major critical approaches that we're about to cover throughout the next few weeks. But just remember that a lot of theory can be done within these schools as well, within these approaches as well. So like I said, today we're getting started with text-based approaches. And then we're going to move on to the others in future weeks. But let's talk a little bit about what we mean by text-based. All right, we are talking about the materiality of text, the material presence, the physical nature of text. That's kind of the original form of text-based criticism. So as we're going to see in a moment, this is a kind of old-fashioned approach. In its oldest original form, it's been around for a really long time. And, hundreds of years ago, text-based criticism often revolved around different editions of texts, different versions, different manuscripts. Because as we probably know, older texts were often written by hand. They were often written in kind of different fragments that might have ended up being kept or saved in different places. So we often had trouble collecting really definitive, accurate editions of older texts, particularly texts from antiquity. But also texts like, Shakespeare's poems and plays. There's a lot of different versions. Some are more accurate than others. This is also true when texts get translated from other languages, right? We have different versions, different editions. A lot of stuff's written in manuscript form, and we have to maybe find those manuscripts and sort of put together the definitive edition that is the most accurate, the most sort of, the closest to the original as we can get. So that's kind of the old style of text-based. Nowadays, text-based approach really means formalism and structuralism, along with what comes after structuralism, which is post-structuralism. So we're going to focus primarily on those techniques, those particular critical sort of styles. They are sort of subgroups within the text-based school. So we're going to focus today mostly on formalism and structuralism. But as we move along, we're eventually going to do author-oriented approaches, I think beginning next week. And again, those are focused on the author, mostly focused on the biography of the author of a literary text and trying to make connections between the text and the author. So biographical criticism has been around for a long time. It's kind of one of the old, sort of more traditional approaches, but it still exists. It's still with us today. And then we're also going to talk about later, we're going to talk about the reader-oriented approach, which is really all about the reception of texts. How are texts received by the audience? How do those readers perceive the texts? What do they think about them? How do they feel about them? What effects, what impacts do the texts make on the readers? So we'll get to that later. And then finally, we have contextual approaches. That's when we analyze literary texts through an examination of historical, social, or political developments that might have been going on at the time the text was written, or they might be reflected in the text in various ways. The text might be sort of about some of those developments, or there might be other connections between those historical or social developments and the text itself. So basically, we're looking at various contexts, various historical, social, or political contexts that might have some kind of influence on the work of literature. And as we're going to see when we get there, contextual approaches have become a lot more popular over the last 30, 40, maybe 50 years. They've kind of increased in popularity and usage in more recent decades. Whereas things like formalism and structuralism, they're a little bit older. They've been around for a long time, but they still exist as well. So let's start with text-based, and let's just go through some of the early stages of this critical approach. So like I said, the book mentions some of these earlier forms of what we might call textual criticism. And that just means, like I said, that we're primarily focusing on the text itself, like the physical object. We're not so much looking at literary elements like characters or plots or figurative language or imagery. We're more interested in manuscripts and editions and trying to track down all these different fragments that might exist in different places. So that's been around for hundreds of years. It was sometimes called the sort of philological approach, very much based on editions, trying to get the definitive edition that readers could use. So that's been around and it still exists today. But like I said, we typically associate that kind of textual criticism with older texts, ancient epics or the plays of Shakespeare. Things that were, have gone through a lot of different versions, a lot of different editions, and like I said, were often written by hand in manuscript form. So sometimes those manuscripts become altered or corrupted over the years, and we have to sort of restore them. So that work still gets done, but that's not really what we do. And that's not really a central part of literary study as it's done in most schools, in most places now in the US. So that's kind of old-fashioned, but sometimes it's useful. We need good editions of older texts if we're going to really study those texts. So we need this work to be done, but it's not really what most undergrads in literature classes are going to be doing. The other thing, the next sort of movement within text-based approaches that the book covers is rhetoric or stylistics. We don't need to get too deep into this stuff, but it's important to just kind of know what rhetoric is, and it kind of has slightly different meanings and usages, but it's very much still with us. If any of you took English 102, you might remember hearing a little bit about rhetoric. I talk about rhetoric in my 102 classes, at least kind of in passing. But we're mostly talking in that class about rhetoric as persuasive writing. Basically, argumentative writing or argumentative speaking, if we're thinking about public speaking, oratory, which was very big in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. So rhetoric was a whole discipline for them, and it didn't just involve persuasion. I mean, that was a big part of it, but they had a whole set of rules about rhetoric. And a lot of their rules related to sort of, how to speak or write eloquently, how to sort of use perfect speech to accomplish your goals. So we're a little bit more interested when we talk about literary study, not so much the argumentative stuff. That's more for English 101 or 102. With literature, we're more interested in some of their rules and some of their focus on what we would call sort of elements of language. because obviously, people working within rhetoric were very interested in language. So they had all of these exercises and rules about things like grammar, what we might call syntax or sentence structure, right? So they were analyzing the structure of sentences, not for the same purposes that we would now, but we still use some of their techniques. They were looking at acoustic features, things that we've talked about in relation to poetry, things like rhyme, things like meter, the rhythmic qualities of writing or speech. They were also interested in the overall form or structure of a literary text. So again, they were analyzing that stuff so that people could give better speeches or write really eloquent arguments. That's not exactly what we're doing, but why we care, why rhetoric still kind of matters for literary study, is they help to pioneer the focus on rhyme, meter, sentence structure, stuff that we still analyze today when we analyze literature. They help to pioneer the study of those particular features. And they were interested in the overall structure, the larger form of literary texts. And we still are today. So we're using a lot of their techniques, even though we're not necessarily doing what they were doing with them. They help us to kind of look more closely at these elements, analyze them, and kind of figure out what they're doing. But then we can jump ahead to the formalists. And formalism is a very large category. It's a big, large, critical approach that includes a lot of different people in a lot of different parts of the world, a lot of different critics, a lot of different scholars practiced formalism, and some still do. Basically, formalism is just a really close examination of structure and form, the structure of literary texts. So we've already talked about this a little bit in previous weeks. When we were looking at lyric poetry, we talked about form. And we talked about all the different things that contribute to the form or the structure of a lyric poem. And we talked about rhyme scheme. We talked about meter. We talked about how the stanzas are divided. Those are all aspects of form. And we saw how a lot of older poetry has set clear, really sort of rigid forms, like Shakespearean sonnets or the ode that Keats wrote. They were following strict forms. They had to have a consistent meter. They had to use a consistent rhyme scheme. But then we looked at more contemporary poetry from the 20th century, still kind of old to us, but that Sylvia Plath poem from the 1960s. And we noticed that even though she uses internal rhyme, things like alliteration and assonance, she doesn't really use a set meter, and she doesn't use in rhyme the way most older poets would. So she's using what we would call more of a free verse or a more of an open form, which means she's not bound by as many rules, but we could still kind of sense an underlying structure in her poem, even though she wasn't as structured as Keats or Shakespeare. She wasn't just all over the place. There were certain things that kind of tied her lines together, if nothing else conceptually, because she was kind of telling a story. And each line was sort of contributing to the story as she walked through these blackberry hedges on her way to the beach. So most works of literature have some kind of form. Lyric poetry is the easiest place to find form and a clear, recognizable structure, especially if you're looking at older poetry where they all kind of had to do it that way, like back in Shakespeare's day or back in the 17 or 1800s. But even more contemporary poetry will have some kind of a structure that we can identify. Maybe not rhyme scheme, maybe not a meter, but maybe every stanza has the same number of lines. That's still a structure. Maybe there's still a pattern that we can pick up on. Maybe certain words get repeated. Or maybe like Plath, the poet's using internal rhyme. Not rhyming words, but using the same sounds to kind of create a pattern or a rhythm. So, and the same is true with fiction. You know, novels and short stories are not as tightly structured as older lyric poetry, but there's still a structure. With a novel, right, that structure might be largely, built through the plot or through how the chapters are arranged. But there's still a structure, there's still a style that we can look at and examine. That's true with plays, it's true with novels, short stories, epics, and of course, very true with lyric poetry. So formalists are really focused on language, the structures of the language. And what makes formalism kind of interesting, and I think what makes it important for us to think about, is they are reminding us in many ways to stick with the text. And I tell this to students all the time. I think you guys can understand this. It's very much human nature when we are reading a new text, reading something for the first time. We often want to get outside of the text because the text is unfamiliar, it's new. We're not immediately sure that we fully understand it or interpret it correctly. So we want to get to more familiar ground. We do this all the time. Readers always do this. When we're reading a new work of literature, we start thinking about ourselves. We start relating the work of literature to our own lives, our own experiences, our own feelings. Or perhaps we relate it to real life events. Oh, this reminds me of this thing I was just reading about yesterday, or something that our friends told us, something that happened to a family member, right? We try to make it familiar. We try to make it recognizable by relating it to our own lives or the lives of people we know or real life events that we know. Or another thing we frequently do is we take the biographical approach, that sort of author-oriented approach where, okay, let's go to Wikipedia and read about this author. Let's learn about this author. Okay, Ernest Hemingway. We know some things about Hemingway. All right, and yeah, knowing some things about him might help us to better read his text, but we're leaving the text, right? And we're reading about Hemingway, or we're thinking about ourselves. We're thinking about our friends. We're thinking about what we saw on the news. And this is common, right? But the formalists rejected all of that. Formalists didn't care about the biography of the author. They didn't care about historical context. What was going on when this novel was written? Who cares? They didn't care. And they also didn't really care how the text made people feel or what the text made people think about. They wanted to focus on the text itself, but not in the way that those older text-based scholars did. The older text-based scholars, like we said, they were mostly interested in the text as a material object, as something physical, something tangible that you can pick up and hold. But for the formalists, they don't care about all the old editions and the manuscripts. They're focused on language, elements of language. A lot of things that we've already been talking about. They want to focus on those elements. They want to focus on the patterns and the structures of language. And to them, that's the best way to arrive at a greater interpretation or analysis of the text. So the book mentions the Russian formalists in like the early 1900s and how they rejected, again, history, the sociological context, all the biographical info. They didn't care about that stuff. They were a lot more focused on what the book refers to as phonetic structures, individual words, sounds, syntax, right? Sentence structure, actual grammatical structures involving phrases and clauses, punctuation, but also rhythm, rhyme, meter, a lot of things that we're already familiar with from our previous work. So some of this is still with us. We still do some formalism even today. And it kind of migrated to the US a little bit later, but still early in the 20th century. So in the book, they mentioned the new critics, or the new criticism, which emerged in the US around the 1930s. And this is kind of the US version of formalism, very similar to what those Russian guys were doing a little bit earlier. So again, the formalists here in the States are very much focused on elements of language. And they felt like the analysis of literature could be just as rigorous, just as, scientific as the study of anything else. So we kind of owe a lot to the formalists. They kind of helped to standardize literary study in some ways. It already existed in previous forms, but they were really bringing a higher level of rigor, of sort of scientific rigor, to the analysis of literature that had not really previously existed. Because again, earlier ways to analyze literature usually revolved around religion or the biography of the author, or sort of like other disciplines. We would look at it maybe for what it said about history, or what it said about, the author's life. But what the formalist wanted to do was just focus on the text itself, not its physical existence, but the words on the page, the language, the elements of language within that text. So they were very big on imagery. We've talked about imagery in this class. They love to look for imagery. They love to look for all kinds of figurative language, especially metaphors. They were very interested in symbolism. And they often favored lyric poetry because their approach really worked best for lyric poetry. You can find the most patterns, the most structures, the most form often in lyric poetry. So they did explore that, but they could explore any type of literature using this basic approach. So they valued irony. They were looking for tension. They were looking for paradox. They were just looking for weird stuff that was happening with language, but they were also looking for a lot of the elements, a lot of the literary elements that we've been talking about throughout this semester. So again, with poetry, we were talking about imagery and figurative language and symbolism. They could also tackle characters, setting, or the plot of a novel. But what kind of sets them apart from the kind of work that had been done previously is they would often read what we might call, various literary elements. They would read them more structurally, not always thematically. There's nothing wrong with reading them thematically, but in the past, a critic might have looked at a character and only thought about that character in terms of what the character expresses about the theme of the novel, or how the character helps to express that theme, or how it all ties together. Whereas a formalist might read that character more structurally. So not just, why is the character important in the plot of the novel, or why is the character important to the overall theme of the novel, but rather, how is this character made? How is this character really working? And what might this character represent? So this kind of gives rise to other related styles or subcategories of the text-based approach. So in time, we start to use kind of a mythological style, where we might find mythological connections to characters. Maybe characters are representing certain figures from religious texts or ancient mythology. And then in time, we have the kind of archetypal approach. Archetypes are just like sort of central ideas, often symbols that appear in our literature. They represent really important things to our culture. So things like the snake, the garden, the mother, heaven and hell, we can read those archetypes we can find them in different works of literature. So now, if we find a character or a symbol, we're not just looking at them thematically in terms of like, well, how do they help to express the meaning of the text? But now we're thinking about how they got made, their origin. Now we can maybe arrive at larger conclusions and do even more with those literary elements as we're sort of looking at archetypes, looking at the structure, not just their importance to the plot, not just their importance to the theme. Formalists were also very interested in narrators, that narrative situation. They were very interested in point of view. Who's telling the story? What perspective do readers get? How are we understanding things? That's very important. In fact, with fiction, where you don't get as many recognizable patterns or forms, oftentimes the narrative situation is where the structure of fiction comes from. Right? Oftentimes the style of narration, whether it be, omniscient, third person, or first person, that narration style provides a structure. It provides a form or a framework for the novel, for the events of the novel. Even the language of the novel is confined to that structure based on the narrator, based on the point of view that we're getting. So they're interested in all of these kinds of literary elements that we've been looking at. But again, lyric poetry worked best because we're going to see the most literary elements in poetry, and we're going to see the most clear, easy to find structures. But remember, literary elements and structures show up in fiction, and they show up in drama. So they're all fair game. They're all stuff that formalists could use. But formalists are not going to talk about the authors. They're not going to talk about history or those social or political developments that other critics might be interested in. The formalists don't care about that stuff really at all. And in the chapter, they mention two sort of fallacies, two common mistakes that formalists identified and basically said, hey, try to avoid these two things: the intentional fallacy and the effective fallacy. The intentional fallacy is when we fail to separate our interpretation of a text from what we think the author of the text intended when he or she wrote the text. So again, a lot of critics would care about this. And a lot of readers care. They want to know what the author had in mind. What were the author's intentions? What was the author trying to say? But formalists would say that doesn't matter. Especially if we're analyzing older text in which, text of which the authors are dead, long dead and gone. So we can't ask them, we can't conduct an interview and get to the bottom of it and discover their intentions. So the formalists would say, forget the author. The author doesn't matter. The language matters. The words, the structures on the page, that's what you're analyzing. It doesn't matter what the author had in mind. The text has a life of its own. The text, for the formalist, was a work of art all by itself, separate from the author, separate from the historical context, separate from the reader even. It's just an aesthetic object, like a painting or like a piece of music. It can be appreciated and it can be analyzed as a work of art, independent from everything else. So they wouldn't care about the author's intentions. They also talk about the effective fallacy. That's when we fail to separate our interpretation of the text from our emotional response to the text. So just like they didn't care about authors, they also didn't care that much about readers. Now, of course, they understood that in order for literature to exist, we have to have an audience, we have to have readers, but they would have argued that the individual feelings or thoughts of readers don't really matter. The emotional effects that a text might create in a particular reader, that's not important. That's not helping us to understand meaning. That's not helping us to understand the form. Emotions are unreliable, and that was a big part of their whole MO. Their whole thing was, we're doing more scientific work. For too long, the analysis of literature has been emotional. It's been based on what we like, how we feel. And to them, that was all kind of elementary. That was kid stuff. They wanted to have that scientific rigor. So for them, there was really only one true meaning of any literary text. And the goal of the critic or the scholar was to simply use these tools, things like imagery, figurative language, characters, use those tools to understand the one true meaning. The author doesn't matter. The feelings of readers don't matter. Just what you see on the page. So again, we don't find a ton of formalists anymore. I mean, some people still do this kind of criticism. They still do this kind of literary analysis. But we don't confine ourselves just to the text most of the time. But we still use one of their most common techniques or practices called close reading. So in any literature class, you're probably going to do at least a little bit of close reading, which is defined as the meticulous, very close and careful analysis of textual features, the kinds of textual features or elements that we've been talking about: imagery, figurative language, symbols, point of view or narrative situation, characters, anything, really, individual word choice, and also if we're looking at poetry, that whole acoustic dimension, meter, rhyme, virtually anything that's unique to the language, unique to the literature on the page. So when we close read, we don't leave the text. And I make my students close read in my higher level literature classes because it's just kind of a staple of what we do. It's just a really big part of literary analysis, literary study. It's not all that we do. It is okay most of the time in upper level lit to look at history, to know a little bit about the author, to step outside the text. We can think about ourselves. Readers do matter. Most of us think that today. But we still close read. And we still look at a lot of the same elements, a lot of the same features of language that the formalists were so interested in. So we have kept some of their techniques, but we're not quite as rigid, we're not quite as strict as they were. And I don't think most of us buy into the idea that there's only one set meaning of most text. I'm not sure if Clare mentions that in his synopsis of the formalists, but that was part of their belief system, at least the new critics here in the U.S. And remember, they were called the new critics back in the 1930s because what they were doing was quite different from some of those older traditional forms of criticism, the biographical approach, or kind of doing, a more historical approach. Things that had been done previously. Like I said, a lot of literature would have been read through the lens of other disciplines. But formalists helped to make literary study kind of its own separate thing. We don't need history. We don't need biography. We're just going to examine the text itself as a work of art. We still do that to a large extent. All right, so let's move ahead. And they also talk about structuralism in the early part of chapter 4, and then we'll sort of conclude with post-structuralism or deconstruction. So these are kind of the inheritors of the formalist tradition. So like the formalists, these kinds of critics and scholars and theorists, the structuralists are very interested in language. They're not as interested in history, biography, politics, all that other stuff. They're mostly focused on language, and they're very interested in structure and form. As you can imagine, structure is in the name. They're very interested not just in the structure of literature, because a lot of early structuralism doesn't even really apply to literature. It's really kind of a sociological or a linguistic concept that we can apply and often do apply to literature. But really, the early structuralists were primarily just interested in the structures of language, how language work, how different languages work. And literature is sort of a system or a structure within a larger structure. So if we think of language as a set of rules, a big structure or framework, within that structure we have literature, which is also kind of a set of rules. It's also a structure of its own. So we have structures within structures, a little complicated. But let's just talk about some of the key concepts that go along with structuralism. So we meet a pretty important figure, I think, in chapter 4, this Swiss linguist and philosopher named Saussure. So he helps to give us a really key concept that's become very important in literary study throughout the 20th and now the 21st century. The whole idea of a sign. So understanding what a sign is will help us to understand what structuralism is and how it works. So, hold on one second. That's my phone. I'll talk to them later. So a couple of key terms that Saussure gives us. Number one, la langue, to translate it as language. Basically, this is the larger system that we're all operating within. But remember that there's always rules to be learned when you're learning a language. And all members of a particular community or a particular language group basically agree on those rules, and they all follow, by and large, they follow those rules. So the English language community, that's a very large group of people, we all generally follow the same rules. We follow the structure of our language, okay? And within a language, you're going to have paroles or words, individual words. This is any specific application of a language in speech or writing. So in other words, this is how we use language. We say words while talking, or we write words if writing. And if we have a collection of words, then we have a sentence. Once we have a collection of sentences, we have a paragraph, and so forth and so on. So these are basic terms that we still use. And we know that paroles, or individual words, will appear in one of two forms. They will appear sort of phonetically as spoken words, right? Again, if we're talking. And then they will also appear as signs, semantic signs, if we're dealing with writing, if we're dealing with written texts. So we're going to focus mostly on signs. And Saussure shows us that any sign has two basic parts. So we should think of signs, written words, as really containing two parts. They are two-part linguistic units. Any word in the English language. The first part of a word is the signifier. Okay? And this is really the word itself. This is the sound that a word makes if it is spoken aloud, or it's the sequence of letters in that word as they appear on the page if you're reading. So let's use the example from the book. The word tree. The word tree, that's a parole. That is a speech event. That is a writing event. When we write that word, or when we say that word out loud in conversation, we're dealing with a signifier. Okay? So the letters T, R, E, E, the sound they make when spoken, or the sequence that they display when they're read, that's the signifier. Okay? And then we have the signified. That's the concept or the thing that the word is supposed to represent. So what the word tree represents is our concept of a tree. So when you hear that word or when you read that word, a picture is drawn in your mind. You think of a tree. Hearing that word or reading that word makes you think of a concept that has a relationship to the word that you're saying, hearing, or reading. So this sounds complicated, but it's really not. But kind of what's important to remember about the signified, the concept of tree, the picture that we get in our minds of tree, the signified is kind of what we call pre-linguistic, which means the concept of tree, you learned that before you learned the word for tree. Because what's so weird about language is, of course, we have to learn it. Nobody is born knowing a language. But think about this, and we can't go back this far in our memories, but before you learned how to talk, when you were still just a baby, you already had the power of observation. You could look around, you could see things, smell things, hear things. So even before you learned language, you probably knew, at least on some level, you knew what a tree was. You didn't have the word for it. You hadn't learned language yet, but you could recognize a tree. You saw trees. You were familiar with trees. Maybe you touched one. Maybe you watched a squirrel or a cat run up one. You knew, in the way that a baby knows things, you knew what a tree was. You could recognize it. You saw a lot of trees around, right? So you get the concept of tree. And then a little bit later, you learn the word for tree. But this is how language works, right? This is how language acquisition works. You kind of have to have the concept in mind in order for the word to make sense, right? You can't just learn the word for tree unless you already know what that word represents. You already have the concept, and then somebody tells you the word that represents that concept. You see that thing? That tall thing that's coming out of the ground? That's a tree. We call that a tree. And then you learn that word, and then you start using it. That's how language works. So, okay, great. I mean, that's fine, and it works pretty well for most of us. But a key point that Saussure makes is that this is a little bit arbitrary. What we have to recognize is there's no natural, inherent relationship between signifier and signified. So there's nothing about those four letters, T-R-E-E. There's nothing about those letters or the sound they make that really naturally, inherently represents a tree, right? We could easily use a different word, because those letters, that sound, they have no natural connection to the concept or the thing itself. That's what Saussure's saying. He's like, it's all kind of made up, right? All language is man-made. So the relationships between signifier and signified, they're not natural. They're not found in nature. They're just sort of agreed upon and settled on by the language communities. Right? So these relationships between signifier and signified, they only make sense within the system of our language, within the structure of the language that all English speakers speak, right? Because we know in other languages, there's different words for the same thing. Not everybody calls it a tree. That's just what English language speakers have decided to do. That's the signifier that we settled on. Other language groups have different signifiers, but the same signified. The same concept. It's still a tree, but a tree is different things, is expressed in different ways in different languages. So that's Saussure's point. He says these relationships, language, only makes sense within very specific contexts, right? And they only make sense within certain language groups. But again, we learn the rules. we learn the rules of our language at an early age. So we understand the relationship between signifiers and signified. So it's no problem. But it can be kind of fun to think about just how arbitrary it is and to think about how much language changes over time. So just think about the word Google for a moment. This is a good example. This kind of exemplifies what Saussure is talking about. Think about Google, that word. Just the word, okay? The signifier. Think about the letters. We got 6 letters, right? Google. Let's just think about those 6 letters, the sound they make when we say them out loud, and the sequence, the appearance, the visual appearance that they have when you see them written. All right? That's our signifier. It's a relatively new signifier. This is a relatively new addition to the English language. Now, let's think about the signified. What does that word represent? What mental image is that signifier supposed to paint in our minds when we hear it or read it? Well, it depends. And this is where it gets complicated, right? Google can actually mean different things. On one hand, Google refers to a search engine, the most popular search engine in the US. But Google is also the name of a company, and Google can be used as a verb. We all know what it means if somebody Googles something, right? So it can be a noun, it can be a verb, it can actually refer to 3 different things. So we see that some of these relationships, they're a little shaky, right? The relationship between signifier and signified here, if we're looking at the word Google, the relationship's a little shaky. Now, it's not confusing for us. We all speak the same language. We're all following the same rules, right? We're all functioning within the same structure. So when I say I Googled something, you know what I mean. When I refer to Google as a noun, you know what I mean, because we're in the same language community. But if you were to go back in time, let's say 50 years ago, if you went back to 1971 and you were talking to an English speaker, but an English speaker 50 years ago, and you said, hey, why don't you go and Google something? They're gonna have no idea what you're talking about, right? They're gonna think that you're insulting them, or they're just gonna be completely mystified. So language changes, right? We come up with new words, and then we have to come up with new relationships between signifier and signified. And sometimes those relationships aren't set in stone, like they can change, they can sort of morph over time. So that's kind of what the structuralists were interested in. They didn't have a problem with language. They didn't have a problem with these relationships, but they just wanted people to understand that there's no inherent or natural connection between signifier and signified. The connection only makes sense within specific language systems. So for them, the system is everything, right? The structure of a language is what dictates meaning, right? The word tree only has any meaning if we stay within the English language structure and we understand the relationship between signifier and signified. But if we leave our language, if we leave our rules, we're dealing with different words, different letters, different sounds, different signifiers, maybe different signifieds. So we have to follow the rules of our structure, of our system, in order for all of this to make sense. So originally, this stuff was used mostly in social science or, again, in linguistics, the sort of scientific study of language. But over time, we started to see structuralism show up in literary analysis and literary criticism, because literature is also using the same structures of language. So we can apply some of these ideas about signifier and signified and the relationships between them. We can use some of that stuff in our analysis of literature. So structuralism became another tool for literary scholars. Again, they're not so much interested in what's going on outside of the text, right? They're focused on the features of the language, but also the structures of of that language. How do the words interact? How are individual words working? How are individual images working? Because again, it can all be sort of reduced to these basic relationships between signifier and signified. We can actually do that on a lot of levels with a lot of different literary texts. So again, we can find patterns. We can find repetitions using a structuralist approach. They're not always necessarily trying to interpret texts, not in the same way that maybe certain other critics would. But they are trying to find ways that the text expresses meaning. Certain structures, certain patterns might help the text do things, might help the text function in very particular ways. And they can help shed light on all of that. So that became pretty popular around the middle of the 20th century. And then a couple of decades later, in the 1960s, and the 1970s, we have the next step in our text-based evolution. We move into what's often called post-structuralism or deconstruction. So they're doing a lot of the same things that the structuralists were doing. But in some ways, this approach is a little bit of a response to the structuralist approach. But once again, they're focused on features of language. They're not as interested in everything outside the text. They're really focused on literary elements and elements of language, features and structures of language. So they're still very interested in form, but they're kind of taking the analysis to the next level. So they're still accepting the basic findings of the structuralist. The whole idea that we have a signifier, we have a signified, and there's kind of this relationship between, sentence structure, syntax, the grammatical arrangement of words and punctuation and meaning. Because that's what the structuralists were kind of interested in, right? How do these actual structures do things and express things? So the deconstructionists kind of started there. The post-structuralists, it's the same thing. Deconstruction, post-structuralism, they're synonymous. But what they kind of determined, they took what the structuralists said about the arbitrary relationship between signifier and signified, they took that and really ran with it. So like Saussure and the early structuralists, they were like, yeah, it's kind of arbitrary, but that's okay. That's just how language works. We agree on these rules, we follow these structures, and it's fine. It works. But the post-structuralists said, actually, the arbitrary nature of language is a little bit more interesting and a little bit more exciting than we previously realized. And their position was, language is very unstable. Language is very unreliable because it's arbitrary, because of the very reasons that the structuralists have already pointed out. So the structuralists wanted to use structure and form and their knowledge of how languages worked in order to arrive at some kind of meaning or some kind of order at work in the text. But see, deconstructionists want to go in the other direction. They say there's really no one set, stable meaning for most literary text, or really for any kind of text, because language cannot be pinned down in that way. Language is very unpredictable, it's very unstable, it changes over time, it does weird stuff. And one thing that deconstruction often does is they kind of get rid of the signified. They're a lot more interested in signifiers. And again, because the relationship between signifier and signified is arbitrary, so they kind of just dispense with it altogether. They're more interested in those individual relationships between signifiers, because they claim that in order to understand one signifier, one word, you have to understand a whole bunch of other signifiers and other words. So again, for the very reason that we saw with Google, how one signifier can represent many different things, for that very reason, they're like, yeah, we don't care that much about the signified. Because that changes. That can just be whatever we want it to be. We just decided that Google could be a verb or a noun. We just decided that that's okay. That wouldn't make sense for other words. That didn't make sense 50 years ago because Google didn't exist as a word. So we're making all of this up. So the deconstructionists would say, all right, so forget about that old sign structure that we learned from Saussure, where it's the signifier and the signified, and every sign has those two elements. Forget that. Let's just focus on signifiers. And the famous example, they mention this in the book, is the word, again, tree. How do we understand tree? How do we understand the definition of that word? Well, there's a good chance we look it up and the definition tells us that a tree is bigger than a shrub or a bush. And then we have to go and look up what a shrub or a bush is. What's a shrub or a bush? Well, it's a plant that's not as big as a tree, but maybe it's bigger than a house plant. So now we have to know what a house plant is, and so forth and so on. So the point that a lot of post-structuralists make is that you can never escape these relationships between different signifiers. The only way we can understand the word tree is if we understand other words. The words for things that are smaller than trees and the words for things that are bigger than trees. Because if we don't know those things, then we're not going to have a mental image. We're not going to have a concept in our minds that the word represents. We're not going to understand, right? So they say it's really all about signifiers. The signified, that just kind of gets made up as we go. But the relationship between signifiers, that's where a lot of the work of language is getting done. And that's what we have to navigate when we're reading something. So this can be frustrating to some people. Some people think deconstruction is kind of chaotic and almost anarchic because, they're basically saying there is no stable meaning. A literary text in particular, it doesn't mean one thing like the formalist would have said. It can mean any number of things. They really fixate on the endless possibility of language because, again, they're saying language... We have to make up all of these rules to confine language, but we really shouldn't do that. We should let language loose, and we should just kind of enjoy the limitless possibilities and all of the different possible meanings that language presents. But instead, a lot of post-structuralists in the 70s argued that in the Western world, like in Western Europe and the US, we always want to confine and capture language. We want to suppress it. We want to make it follow all of these rules, all of these patterns and structures. And in reality, it's more fun to see possibility, to see more play, to see more potential. But they also acknowledge that you can never really get outside of language. I mean, they're kind of aware at how limited their own approach is because they're calling attention to problems with the structuralists and problems with the formalist approach, but they're also confined by language. They recognize that even though they don't want language to have to follow all these rules, in order for us to speak to one another and communicate and understand each other, you can't get outside of a language system. You can't get outside of the structure to some natural, pure existence, right? Language is so important to human life, and we learn it so early in life, we don't even usually remember learning it. You can't get outside of it. There's no pure state outside of language where we can go and really get at true meaning and true relationships. So deconstructionists know that. So they're like, yeah, we're trapped too, but at least we know it. And at least we're aware of the problem. So those are just some of the most common text-based approaches. And like I said, they're all still around. But nowadays, post-structuralism is still pretty popular. We don't see quite as much formalism in its original form. but we still use close reading. We still use a lot of those techniques, and the structuralist and post-structuralist helped us to learn more and understand more about the way language works, and of course the way language works in literary texts. So we still use all of this stuff today. All right, so that's it for this week. I will see you next week, and please let me know if you have any questions about the reading.